HR and recruiters, what is an instant? Well, this person isn't getting the job thing a candidate can do during a job interview. Friend of a friend, call him Bob for short, got a job despite not being the best qualified candidate. Down to the final two for a teaching job, there was Bob, who was a solid, unremarkable candidate. Clearly good enough for the role, but nothing special about him as a candidate. And then there was Charlie. Charlie was an absolute rock star teacher. Won awards, young, dynamic, and driven, outstanding teaching demo, just the nicest guy who had glowing references. Then they asked any questions, and he replied, "Could you tell me if you'd have a problem with a teacher dating a student?" Yes, they would. Bob got the job. This was a secondary school with sixth form in the United Kingdom, so age from 11 years old to 18 years old. Story 2. When I worked in a bank as a manager, one internal candidate I interviewed put her finger in front of my face while I was talking and said, "I'm going to stop you right there." I went with the other person who didn't put their finger to my face. Story 3. He had a guy who was a little rough, but was looking quite promising for a design role. He blew it with me by saying, "I'll turn this company around in 6 weeks," and a few more comments along those lines, with a theme of, "You are currently messing it up." This is a small, successful company. I wanted him to fit in, not turn us round. Story 4. I was interviewing someone who had previously worked at the American embassy in his home country. The language barrier was very difficult, and he was having a tough time with the interview. Partway through, he showed me some certificates he received from the embassy job as awards for good work. The conversation then went like this. Me, can you tell me the story about some of these awards? Him, huh? Me, I'd like to know why you received these awards. Maybe you can pick one of them and tell me the story about how you got it. Him, awards? Me, yes, these things you're showing me right now. Tell me about them. Him, they are awards. Me, right, tell me how you received them. Him, how? Me, yes. What did you do to get them? Him, I don't know. It's your embassy, you tell me. That last bit was the longest sentence he spoke to me during the entire interview. Story 5, so many. Making comments about getting into an employee's skirt as they walked past. Also how to get reported to HR department before even getting the job. Explaining how they took copies of all the company's code home. Explaining how they used to work 2 jobs at once, pretending to work for one from home. Explaining how they program games for their PlayStation with Notepad. While being interviewed by programmers for a sales role, telling the interviewer that the problem they are trying to solve is impossible, even though it was literally 3 lines of code. It was a warm-up question. Story 6. This guy's resume had a ton of its skills, technologies in it, and that should have been a red flag. But we didn't have many candidates for the position, so we gave him a shot. First question I asked him was, "So I see you have hypertext preprocessor on your resume. Can you tell me what types of environments you've worked with it in?" His answer was, "What? I don't know that." And he didn't say it like he didn't know hypertext preprocessor. He said it like he'd never heard of it. When I showed him a copy of his resume, he scratched out hypertext preprocessor with a pen and said, "My friend did my resume for me. I'll have to update that." That was the end of any consideration of hiring him. I texted the recruiter to come get him, and it took them 20 minutes to get there. To be polite, we continued the interview, but it was a long 20 minutes. I don't remember everything, but every question was a train wreck. He insisted he knew Active Directory because he kept it on a USB drive he carried with him. He got a text and stared at his phone for about 10 very uncomfortable seconds and then said, "Hold on, this guy is trying to sell me some Windows," while he texted back. When asked what types of teams and groups he's used to working with, instead of saying very structured or easygoing, he rattled off about 10 names, first names, as if we knew who they were. When we asked what that team was like, he was like, "Oh, you know," and then repeated the names again. Someone asked him to walk them through a typical day at his current job. I don't think he said anything about work, and instead talked about his wife and his kids. Then he told us a story about a funny thing his uncle did years ago. I asked him how his work was presented to him and whether he used a ticketing system or if he used any project management software, and he said, "They call me." When I asked if he meant a help desk environment, he said no, "They call me at home." He couldn't elaborate on how any of that worked or what he did after they called him. He jokingly insinuated that the real reason he was trying to get this job is because he wasn't making enough money in real estate and his wife wouldn't have sex with him. Why I had to call the recruiter to come get the guy. We're a fairly old school, literally, organization, and our interview and recruiting process is overcomplicated. Candidates apply, they meet with their department, then they interview with my team. Sometimes they interview with other teams before or after my team, and then they meet with their department again who escorts them out. This interview was several years ago. Story 7. A woman casually mentioning that she wanted to set her ex on fire, totally unprompted and unrelated to anything that had been asked. Later, when asked how to handle difficult customers, she said she would set them on fire as well. Story 8. Former head teller. My old manager once came over to my desk after an interview and let out a massive sigh and declared, quietly so only I heard him, that he needed a double of scotch. Apparently, the person showed up to the interview in a white wife-beater tank, ripped khaki shorts, and had the N-word in his email on his resume. Interviewee was white if it matters. Needless to say, my boss did not hire them. Story 9. I worked for a big, well-known company, and we were recruiting interns straight out of college. The questions are more of a get-to-know-you questions rather than actual knowledge of the work or experience. The company actually gave us a paper with some example questions, like the one below that we could ask if we ran out of ideas. So it's going pretty well, very bubbly, chatty girl, and I have impression she would fit the team. Until me. How do you handle multiple deadlines in a short time period if you have 3 exams close to each other or an exam and a big class project? Interviewee. Well, you try to do your best, but if I realize I cannot meet both deadlines, I just call in sick. Story 10. In high school, I was in a group interview for a crappy mall retail job, and they asked us if we had any fun nicknames. This college-aged kid next to me perked up and looked excited to answer. He then proudly proclaimed that his friends like to call him DJ Big Balls. Story 11. Been doing a bunch of interviews lately for an intermediate network engineer. I had a guy start off an interview with, "I don't really know anything about networking." Story 12. A guy showed up late with no apologies or remorse for keeping us waiting and was wearing a hoodie and sweatpants. This was for an internship at a law firm. Story 13. Had a guy literally sprint out of the building. I wasn't the interviewer. I am a web developer. But as we were trying to hire a second developer, I was asked to prepare some basic web development questions. These were not hard. These were absolute bare basics, babies, first code stuff. This guy came in, started interviewing, and was apparently doing okay. Not fantastic, but enough to keep him in consideration. Then he saw that we had a test and he apparently grabbed his bag and ran out of the room. All I saw was this guy sprint full tilt past the rest of the office, shoulder barge out the door, and run off into the distance, followed by our 2 directors stumbling out of the interview office, laughing uncontrollably. I guess he lied on his CV. Story 14, telling me, "You obviously know more than me, and that's why I need to hire you for a position. I am the direct supervisor for, in the most condescending tone I've ever heard in my almost 15 years of my career. Knowing more than me was required. I'm only in charge of this position because I know more than my bosses about it, but we were looking for someone who specialized in that role. The attitude of 'I'm obviously better than you' was not required and lost him the second interview. Until that point, I was loving his confidence and obvious knowledge, but he just took it too damn far." Story 15. During my first management gig, I was sifting through resumes for an internship program we had, and one of the candidates printed her resume on pink glittery paper and sprayed it with perfume. I didn't even look at her resume. To this day, they probably still find glitter on that desk. Story 16. I was interviewing clerks for a gas station. One was a relative of a friend of my supervisor. He was clean and showed up on time. He also answered every question with, "Back when I was selling substances." My supervisor said I had to hire him, so I did. It went as well as you might imagine. Story 17. When I worked in HR department, one applicant, who was in her 40 years old, submitted a 40-page list of achievements, certificates, and sorority girl achievements from 20 years prior. Needless to say, she failed at even getting an interview. Provide what the company is asking. If you want to include degrees, certificates, limit it to a reasonable amount. Your degree or certificates related to the job duties. Flooding the people with a bundle of items is not impressive. Story 18. This reminds me of the time I took an old friend to see my Marine recruiter. He asks my friend if he's ever done substances, which the obvious answer should be no. He goes and says, "Yeah." Recruiter looks shocked, looked over at me, then looks back at my friend, and slowly laughs and says, "Well, which ones? Maybe we pretend you didn't say that." He goes on to say, "Oh, I tried substances in high school, but I'm trying to stop." He didn't join. Surprise, I know. Story 19. This was me actually giving the job interview, so I was the one hiring. We had to dramatically underpay the salespeople, so our choices were horrible. But none were worse than this one creepy guy. He was basically a serial killer. He walked in the conference room, and right away I knew he was sketch. I should have ended the interview right when I saw him. Ill-fitting suit, slicked back hair, looked shady. I didn't want to judge a book by the cover, though, so I gave him a chance. I asked the first couple questions. Tell me about yourself, that kind of crap. Here's when I asked him to leave. I said, "So tell me why you want to work in sales." He goes, "Well, I'm new in town, so I think this will be a great way to get to meet people, especially women." And when he said especially women, he winked at me. You just right now typing this gave me the creeps and made me shiver all over. Story 20. Was interviewing for a call center role in the healthcare industry, and the following all happened in the same assessment center. Lady wouldn't stop talking about how her mom had cancer. I sympathized initially, but every answer would turn into, "My mom is sick." Even technical questions about familiarity with systems would somehow lead back to her mom. No doubt she was qualified for the role, but when you have to deal with individuals going into hospital, you cannot start harping on about your personal experiences. A guy kept going on about how he was great for the role and excited to work with us, and at the end of the session, he even left saying, "I look forward to getting my acceptance call." Little did he realize, a manager in the assessment center recognized him and told us his real story. He had been hired with us as a temp agent before, but after a week of training, 2-week course, called in sick for a week before quitting via text to the same manager who had the texts on her phone and showed them to us, and saying he had emailed HR department only to list an email that did not even belong to our company. I don't know how he thought he could say he had never worked for us and get away with it. Another guy who was so obnoxious and self-centered kept going on about how many businesses he had run, and during the one-on-one interview said, "Excuse my French," and then proceeded to drop the F-bomb, which makes one think he had a second to think about it, and then decided to still swear during an interview. Story 21. I was on an interview, and once they explained what their business did, I stated, "I don't even want this job." Needless to say, I didn't get the job at another job during a corporate takeover. They interviewed all current staff to possibly become store managers in the new corporate structure. During the interview, they gave astronomical sales projections that I immediately called out as unattainable. I did, however, back up my remark with our monthly average sales and best sales numbers to date for each store, as I had been a store manager already. Obviously, though, the new corporation was not pursuing me as a viable option. Again, I did not want that job. Story 22. Did not happen to me, I'm a dude, but a woman recruiter friend of mine who had packed on a few kilos was asked by a candidate at beginning of interview, "When are you due? You are glowing, shortest. Interview, Eva." Story 23. My dad is a quality control manager with an asphalt company. They build roads and stuff like that. And he said that once a guy with really good qualifications came in for an interview as a lab tech and said, "You can go ahead and fire all your other techs because I'm the only one you're going to need." The interview lasted 5 seconds before my dad told him to duck off. Story 24. I've only conducted one interview. It was in my department, and my boss had left on an emergency and told me to do it with no notice. She had put open schedule on her resume and application, but proceeded to tell me that she had school sports, and volunteering obligations. It dropped her availability for at least the next 5 months to 2 weekday afternoons after 5, we close at 7, and Sundays after 1, we close at 6. She did not receive my recommendation to be hired. Story 25. Interviewee dropped multiple F-bombs. Job interviews are one of the most formal things a person will go through. Now, I'm not shy for swearing language, but they didn't know that. It just showed I couldn't trust her in any formal situation or important business meeting. It wasn't the swearing, it was the lack of judgment. I'm not saying that swearing disqualifies all people from all jobs, but rather it is a huge risk. The chances of getting a job solely based on the fact you swore is very, very low. However, the chances of not getting a job because you were lackadaisical when it comes to swearing is much, much higher. This is where your judgment comes into play. Can you do the calculus here about what is appropriate? Context also matters, and in this case, it was a much more formal, historic office rather than, say, a casual startup. Story 26. My Marine recruiter told this story of this dude who was trying to join. He came in to talk about enlistment, and this is apparently about how the conversation on if he'd pass a substances test went, "So do you smoke?" "Yeah, but not in a while." "When was the last time you smoked?" "I haven't smoked for about a week." "How long ago exactly?" "Like 4 or 8 days." "This morning." Story 27. I was interviewing an apparently well-qualified senior project manager for a major, full-time project. She hadn't worked for 6 months, and while that certainly wasn't a deal breaker, I asked, "How come you left your last job without another to go to?" She said, "Oh, I had problems with my manager." Tiny red flags waving, I asked her to explain. She said, rolling her eyes, "Well, he wanted me to come to work like every day." I must have looked shocked because she added, "Would you want me to work like every day?" I thought that maybe I was on camera and was being pranked, but retained my composure. "Well, this is a full-time job, running a major project." She cut me off and said, "I don't think I'll like that. Let me clarify, every day." The job was a simple full-time role from Monday to Friday from 9 to 5. Story 28. Not a HR, but I'm currently conducting interviews to recruit a new team member. We saw a guy who was great on the paper, but when asked about hobbies, he said, "Seduce and had sex with women." He was done at this moment. Story 29. A guy turned up where I worked for an interview and started giving the receptionist grief because the interviewer was running late. It clearly wasn't her fault, and it was entirely unacceptable. The interviewers didn't even bother, just invited him to leave. Story 30. Talk over, interrupt me. I'm a female manager, and this happens more often than you might think. Almost always with men. I have ended interviews very quickly because I just couldn't finish a sentence. Also, be rude to our front desk reception team. Conversely, if my front desk reception team likes you or you stood out to them, that's a big bonus in your favor. Story 31. I'm not in her department, but I have conducted many interviews. For me, it's when candidates divulge what is clearly sensitive information on the part of their existing previous employer. Don't tell me about how your company is getting ready to release a disruptive new SaaS product, even though it hasn't been announced yet. Have some discretion. It means they're a liability and would continue to be so under our employ. Likewise, it's a no from me when I ask a candidate about why they're leaving a job or something like that, and they turn it into an excuse to slag off, trash talk someone they worked with previously. I don't like drama. Story 32. Is that a photo of your wife? Wow, she's hot. Is she at home? What's your home phone number? Demonstrating self-confidence. 100%. Demonstrating stupidity and many other bad qualities. 100%. Story 33. Preface. I work in a medical substances dispensary. Had a candidate drop off his resume. Seemed like a promising candidate until I flipped over his resume and saw that he had a wish list of dispensaries he wanted to work at, and a reminder that he had an interview that same day, later that afternoon. My company wasn't on his wish list. He later called to ask if his resume had any writing on the back, and asked me what time his interview was. I wished him luck. I didn't hire him. Have had countless candidates who only wanted to work at a medical dispensary because they thought it would be chill, could be high all day, or get free samples. None of them were called back. Story 34. I used to work in staffing. I have a few. Showing up ridiculously late. You should never be late for an interview, but a few minutes may be forgiven. An hour will not be. Smelling like substances, regardless of the position. Being rude to anyone in the office before the interview. My favorite, interrupting the interviewer by answering a phone call and sticking your finger in the interviewer's face. Story 35. When I was younger, I worked in a bar, and people would come in and give us, the bar staff, their resumes to give to management. One guy had picking up chicks, his spelling not mine, listed under interests. After a good chuckle with my colleagues, that resume got binned. Story 36. Not a recruiter or in our department, but as part of my training to possibly move up in the company I work at, I sat in on a few interviews to observe recently. I work in the health and social care sector, and one of the questions that is asked in the interview is, how do you make sure that you leave your work at work and not take it home with you? One of the candidates said something along the lines of, I work until the work is done, and if that means taking it home, then so be it. After the interview, the service manager and my manager conferred and said that this answer was the main reason this person would not be getting the job. I asked why, and they told me there were a few reasons this is a bad answer. First, burnout in health and social care is a huge problem, and they don't want to take someone on if they're going to work themselves into the ground. Second, if someone works late, as a public sector employer, government-funded, they are legally required to give time back for extra hours spent working. Overtime pay isn't such a thing here, and they can't be granting time off in lieu all over the place because core hours wouldn't be covered. Third, it shows someone unwilling to ask for help or to delegate, and this role in particular is all about collaborative working. And this person seemed to be a bit of a lone wolf, insistent on forging on alone, which is not the attitude they're looking for. Story 37. For a while, I did secondary interviews to help out a new store. They'd do the recruiting for candidates and pass on to me the ones they liked best. I get some okay results, but one supervisor had no idea how to shut down a candidate that wasn't suitable. I coached her over and over, but she had too soft of a heart. I miss when I had one pre-retail. This meant I got all kinds of characters. The worst, a candidate who laughed at me. He didn't have an answer for my first two questions, then just laughed at my third and shook his head. I shut down the interview and made it clear it was due to an inability to complete it. I politely asked if he had any questions, and he said, "Is the job paid by direct deposit or a check? Do you need a void check from me?" "No, sir, you're never getting a paycheck from us. Ever." Story 38. I was once around when my old boss interviewed a potential bouncer candidate. This guy lived about 45 minutes drive away from the location, had no license to drive, nor a car, and no, there were no buses or other method of transportation available around the time the club closed. When asked if he had a friend or some other accommodation figured out, he simply told that he's going to pick up some girl every work night and spend the night at her place. Because hey, isn't there always a line of chicks just waiting to have sex with the bouncer, right? Never saw him again. Story 39. I female was the recruiting manager, had a male coworker with me who was learning the interview process, and I was letting him talk through the questions I had previously selected. The candidate clearly thought I was the secretary, would try and be flirty with me when my coworker would talk, and even winked at me after saying something like, "Oh, well, I would just help her, you know?" Question was something about what would you do about a coworker in trouble? Yikes. Story 40. I'm a recruiter in a tech company. We mainly hire experienced algorithm and software developers, so generally you tend to expect people who know how to interview. Nope. 1. I've been asked by a candidate for a team leadership role if I was Indian the first 2 seconds of the interview. He actually got the job and works for the company today, a year and a half later. 2. Another candidate spent 30 minutes complaining about his current workplace and how terrible it is, while I desperately tried to cut him off and get him to answer my damn question. 3. I was hit on during an interview by a candidate twice my age. 4. I had a candidate for a testing position whom I headhunted on LinkedIn, and he agreed to talk and hear about the position. During the phone call, he said something along the lines of, "I'm headhunted all over. I need to hire an assistant because the phone won't stop ringing," in a very arrogant tone. He was very annoying and full of himself during the entire conversation. He did not progress to a personal interview, but every time we open a similar position, he applies. Story 41. Interviewed someone for a teaching position in China. Me. Do you have any preference in regards to which city in China you would like to live in? Candidate. I'm very interested in either Shanghai or Korea. Nope. Story 42. Was helping my manager interview some people for elderly care work in a residential home, United Kingdom. A lady came in and immediately declared she would help serve food and drinks, but no washing up or cooking. Would help only the ladies get dressed, but no intimate personal care, and will not dress men. No evening or night shifts. Will not change nappies, incontinence pads. Will not push wheelchairs. My manager was pretty stunned. I couldn't help myself and asked, "So what damn will you do?" I handed her the CV back and told her we will call you. We did not. Story 43. She was throwing out questions out of the blue, then answering them herself without even waiting for a reaction from me, the interviewer. "Sir, do you know why I welcome challenges other people would immediately avoid?" "Well, sir, let me tell you." Story 44. I interviewed a guy who told me he was smarter than his boss and that he'd be smarter than any boss he had in the future as well. Apparently, this was funny too because he laughed. No one else did. Story 45. I have one that I did. I worked at an outdoorsy attraction, like a national park, in a different department from the one the interview was for. I would be keeping my current casual job helping guests day to day, but also wanted to be a guide, which was way more interesting and paid better. I had a lot of experience in teaching and performance stuff, and great relationships with all the park staff on my teams, and would have been great at the job. In the group interviews, I was streets ahead of most and got on really well with the recruiters in my one-on-one interview. So how did I duck it? All the other candidates turned up in their park uniforms, neat and ironed, but the uniforms they wore in their other departments, which was the same as the guides wear. Not me, though. I had no idea that anyone would do that. Thought we had to dress up. Like best, smartest clothes, we had to look professional for the interview. I wore a pinstripe suit. Guess who looked most put of place? Guess who didn't look like part of the team? Like at all. Guess who hasn't thought far enough ahead to realize the most professional attire might be the clothes you'd wear actually doing that profession? Worst bit is then I'm still working with the people they hired as the guides. One was from my department and a terrible employee. Learned a good lesson that day. Story 46. I once heard a judge tell a guy he needed to get a note from the interviewer. The guy had said to the judge that he couldn't make it to court when scheduled because he had a job interview. The judge said that was fine. The case would be continued and scheduled for a later date, but that the guy would have to get a note from the interviewer confirming the date and time, or else. I figure that interview didn't go so well. Story 47, asking if they can reschedule the interview because he just got an interview for a job I really want. We just suggested it might be best to not reschedule at all. No apologies for the inconvenience. Rescheduled 15 minutes before the interview was about to start. We initially agreed until he repeated over and over how he really wanted the other job more. Sorry for those omitted details. Story 48. One that's famous in my company is the anti-vegan. He was doing a great job in the interview process and was apparently the front runner until he was having an interview with his boss's boss. He's halfway through the interview and unprompted says, "None of you are anything weird like vegan, are you?" Haha, and goes on a bit of a rant about them. Little did he know the man interviewing him had been vegan for 4 years to support his wife. She'd been having some serious health problems and found a vegan diet helped her. So he adopted it out of solidarity and stuck with it. The rant ended. There was silence amongst the interviewees who OFC were aware of this story, and he was asked to leave. Story 49. Here's the story. Government job, guy comes in, reeking like piss. By reeking, I meant exactly that. The smell was overwhelming at best. The candidate doesn't mention it, so the recruiter tries to act professionally by not mentioning it either. Then the candidate casually explained later on during the interview that he didn't have time to go home after work to change clothes, and that he works with homeless people downtown. I'm sure most recruiters wouldn't hire the guy, but he got the chance and became one of the best of the team. I'm a friend of the HR employee who hired him. Story 50. Years ago, I was tasked with opening a new branch in another state. We needed to hire many people in a relatively short time. I spent my days interviewing 10 people a day in a tiny makeshift office while the building was under construction. One person will be forever burned into my memory. She came in professionally dressed, and the conversation started off great. As we gradually went through the interview questions, things got weird fast. She started to tie her horoscope sign into multiple answers. She'd say, "That's just the Scorpio in me, and I'm a Scorpio, so that's why I do it this way." Then she proceeded to get louder and angrier with each question. Simple questions like, "How many years' experience do you have in X?" would leave her basically shouting and glaring. The most unnerving thing was how her eyes seemed to change from the original handshake to sitting down and answering questions. She would stare at me in an unsettling, wide-eyed way that was confrontational and aggressive. She went from seemingly upbeat and happy to be there to me feeling like she was going to attack at any moment. I wrapped it up and walked her out, making sure she left the building. And as she was leaving, she turned around with a huge smile and said sweetly, "I hope to hear back from you soon." What? I've interviewed thousands of people since then. She remains the most disturbing one ever. Story 51. Walked into the interview with her phone up, texting. Sat down, continued texting. Finally looked up to meet my eyes when done. I just motioned to the door. Edit. This was for a teaching position. Story 52. Had to fill a junior networking position in the DC metro area. Candidates had to be US citizens, but the pay was on the extreme low end for the skills we were looking for. Additionally, my boss wouldn't let me work with the HR rep directly and wasn't passing the list of requirements I wrote to the HR rep. So I got a lot of bad resumes. So I finally get a resume that looks like someone has done networking before. He has a bunch of small branch office routers and switches listed on his resume. My boss does a phone screen and has the guy come in. Me. Tell me about a difficult problem you solved. Guy. I don't know. Me. Okay. Tell me how to create and apply an access list on this router model you have listed on your resume. Guy. I don't know. Me. Okay. Can you tell me any command you can run on any of the devices listed on your resume? Guy. No. I thanked him for coming in and told him someone would be in touch. No idea how he thought that interview would go. So I guess my example is not being able to talk about anything on the resume they provide. Story 53. One of my old lecturers used to tell us about when he worked for a marketing firm or something and was interviewing photographers. Most were pretty similar. Nothing outstanding. This one guy rocked in with a custom handmade wooden box filled with cardboard thin wooden frames on every photo. Very swish and fancy looking. The photos were beautiful as well, and they'd probably have gone with the guy on the spot, but he turned up for the interview in a string wife beater, Daisy Dukes, and flip-flops. Story 54. Group interview. As an icebreaker, the candidates were asked to write an interesting fact about themselves, then work out as a group which one belonged to who. One guy wrote about how he wanted to be a stuntman in his teens, so he dressed up as a bird, climbed into a tree, and defecated over people. He did not get the job. Story 55. One guy turned up to the interview drunk. Bear in mind this was for a bar staff position, and all three panelists were bar managers, so we knew instantly. Every question we asked would be met with the same answer. A long story about his previous job, boss, which were both the best ever. When asked if he had any notice to give to a current employer, he listed off every job he had since he was 16 years old. Story 56. Handing me a full-page-long list of courses that the candidate has taken, and then telling me that they can only work on 2 days a week for 2 hours at a time because they're about to start 3 more courses. The best part is that these were all courses about getting back into employment. Story 57. Working as a recruiter, I always had several completely inexperienced guys applying for TL and senior positions, despite having just graduated from some mediocre coding course and having nothing to show for it. They somehow always were a very specific brand of a person. However, the record on disqualified candidates belongs to an applicant for a junior motion designer position. They didn't attach a portfolio. I thought maybe they didn't get around to make one yet. It can happen, and I like giving people the benefit of doubt. I figured I could just give them a home task if needed. I asked them the standard questions about how experienced they were with standard industry softwares, After Effects, Blender, and a couple of others. I can use Word. Does it help? Story 58. Work in it when someone says, "I did this." And when you press for their actual role, they can't describe how to solve the problem. Ticket taker versus engineer. Story 59. I had a guy tell me how he got fired for stealing, but claimed he was marketing by giving product to pretty girls. Another explained he was fired for punching a guy at work and breaking his nose. Said next time he would go for a punch to the stomach, less to see. Another looked around my office and asked if his would be bigger and he would need to order specific furniture because he can't work on old dirty stuff. The job was a maintenance clerk. I had a mom sit outside the office while I interviewed the 19M after she comes in and said he needs his names to remind him to take his ad meds daily, and we should have someone remind him to pay attention. He interviews for an inspecting job. I have dozens more, also ones I thought would be busts based on first impressions but were rock stars. One guy came in for a manager job and was in dirty torn jeans and shirt. He explained his dad had a heart attack 2 days before, and he needed to harvest dad's crop, so he came straight from the field to the interview. Dude was a great employee and was promoted. Story 60. If they have a tongue ring and play with it, I squirrel and don't hear anything they actually say. Disparage their old job boss without being prompted to discuss past employment. Story 61. Did some recruiting in my old job and occasionally now in my own company. In both, providing education and training for patients at home, and on my own company also providing nurses for construction sites. Plants. We'll give a few. A candidate that stated she would not visit patients of a certain nationality. A candidate that refused to travel more than 10 miles from his home. The city from side to side is 25 miles. Also, traveling was well compensated. A candidate that during "Do you any questions?" asked deadpan if it's okay to have a six-pack of beers during his lunch break. A candidate for a power plant position said she could work for companies A and B, but not company C because she had a couple of unpaid bills with them. A candidate that started spewing conspiracy theories during the interview. Story 62. Bad-mouthing all previous employers. You know this phrase. If the first person you meet in a day is an a-hole, they're an a-hole. If everyone you meet in a day is an a-hole, you're the a-hole. If asterisk, every single company who's given you a job is awful, I'd be a bit suspicious. Story 63. My best answer for "why do you want to work at company" was the guy who legit said that he wanted to work there because he was friends with people at the location, and he thought that the job would be easy, insinuating because of it. Story 64. Worked as a telephone interviewer. I've had plenty of people think the telephone interview is just a formality. It's not. The interviewer decides on who goes through. Had one candidate who was a bit cocky and full of herself. She gave fairly good, but not amazing answers. Lost a few marks on communication, but was still looking to pass. But at the end, she started to make comments about how she didn't want to end working in a call center position like me, and that she knows she was going to pass, so I just let her know when the next stage is. Her tone was so arrogant, I had enough reason to fail her communication. I politely reminded her that, actually. I am the one marking the interview, and that we'll be in touch once I've marked the interview. She tried to complain, but after my managers listened back, as they are obliged to do, they couldn't fault me at all. Story 65. An amazing recruiter I know got me an interview at a brilliant company. While we were grabbing a beer to talk about the role, he said, "It goes without saying, but dress well." I asked him if there's a reason he says that. He was recruiting for a tech company that had a pretty stellar reputation and found a candidate with terrific skills and glowing references. We'll call him Fred. Now this recruiter always asks both the company and candidate to call him once the interview is over to see how things went. The company calls him back way earlier than expected to tell him that Fred turned up in shorts and a black shirt that said "Damn Java." Fred wasn't hired, and the recruiter had to apologize profusely to that company, but they cut ties with him. Shame. He's a great guy who is good at his job. Story 66. I was interviewing for a job way above my pay grade, but as it was a competency-based interview, I was capable of conducting the interviews. Most candidates were mid-level managers. In response to a question about using information to make a decision, one candidate gave the following response. Several employees came with a complaint about abusive behavior from a colleague within earshot of customers. I told them I didn't like tattletales, so they came back with a union rep and CCTV footage. Disciplinaries take a lot of paperwork, so I just called everyone into my office and told them I don't expect them to be ratting on each other. When prompted as to what information was available for his decision, he clarified they had CCTV footage. If I watched it, I'd be accountable since I'd actually know what happened, so I wiped the tapes. Story 67. We had some fun ones at the pub poker company I used to work at. Number one cause for rejection? Photos of tattoos. You have a poker-related tattoo. You think that sending us a picture of it will show us how much you love poker. It also shows us your poor judgment, as that is a picture of your flipping a rise, you muppet. Also had one for an admin position written in pencil on graph paper where, under experience, they put, "Ran a 2-year campaign for my friends." And I did actually argue with my boss that that isn't nothing, but he simply said, "It's on graph paper, it's going in the bin." Same kid had also put that he had experience of working independently as his parents had gone for a 2-week holiday and left him on his own. Story 68. One time I was interviewing a guy for a position in a book publishing house. One of my questions was, naturally, what do you like to read mostly? His response, "Nah, I don't like books, too boring." Story 69. I had one dude submit a resume that was handwritten on crumpled paper that came from a top-bound spiral notebook, with frilly edge and all. That went right in the garbage. Probably the one that makes me want to end the interview right away. Candidates who brag about their work ethic and punctuality. The ones who tell you they are never late to work, always are. Story 70. Overambitious people who make it clear they are there for the title and want to progress fast. They have a habit of ruining a positive team environment and also don't care about performing the role. Just ticking boxes to get promoted and are associated with high turnover as they chase the next big thing. I've had several candidates lie to me about their skills or abilities, which is a no-no. Story 71. I was interviewing candidates for an administrative role in a fast-paced logistics office. One of my usual questions was, what will be your next steps if you don't get this position? I was looking for comments around self-analysis of skills. Maybe have someone do mock interviews with me, etc. I asked this question to a female candidate who was probably borderline at best, who said, "Oh, I'd like to start a club, where couples and singles could have a nice meal and then have sex with whoever they wanted." The account manager was sitting with me and his jaw hit the table and his face was beet red. I politely thanked her and wished her success in her future endeavors. The other manager couldn't understand how I kept a straight face and continued the interview. I told him that, at this point in my career, not too much of what candidates say surprises me. Story 72. Interviewing for a technical role. Tell me about a time you took initiative. I realized our core system had a flaw that could cause the whole company to collapse. So what did you do about it? I told my boss about it. And then what happened? He told me not to worry about it. So what did you do? Nothing, because my boss told me not to worry about it. Story 73. I worked in a place where when interviews were being held, the boss would sit at the reception desk, not letting them know he was the boss. While the department heads were the interviews, each candidate had to wait for about 10 minutes in reception where the boss would watch how they acted outside of the interview itself. After the interview, the boss would discuss his options with the department heads. One guy rang his GF and started getting about how long he had to wait and talking about the old fart receptionist. The interview itself went well, but safe to say he didn't get the job. Important to remember, the interview really starts when you walk in the front door. Story 74. I had the opposite of this instant, if I may retell it here. The person being interviewed had just knocked it out of the park, and we were making small talk before my next applicant was scheduled to arrive. He said something to the effect of, "Nothing could have possibly gone wrong." Classic Simpsons reference. To which I replied, "That's the first thing that's ever gone wrong." Apparently, we were both huge nerds for Classic Simpsons. I let him know the timing was terrible. Had I known that about him, we never would have needed to run the interview in the first place. Joking OFC. We still worked together. After I left that job, I started my own company and he was my first hire. Friends for life. Story 75. Hygiene. It was for a designer role in a high-tech company. My manager interviewed him first, before coming back to my desk rather soon. I said, "Wow, that was quick." He replied, "He's all yours." I opened the door to the interview room and almost fell over backwards. Whatever place this guy came from, water was scarce. For me, I had spent part of my youth shoveling horse manure on the family farm, so I had techniques to breathe while in harsh environments. So I talked to him and attempted to determine if he had any special skills that we needed, thinking that we could treat personal grooming as a separate issue. He had nothing really remarkable to offer, though. Story 76. Before we even get to the interview. If your resume has grammatical, spelling errors, atrocious formatting, etc., I'm sorry, but you're likely being declined on the spot. Don't have a resume? No problem. This is entry-level work I mostly hire for anyway. But if you don't have a resume and can't fill out the online form just to give me some kind of idea about yourself, and instead just give me contact info and a list of skills, I'm sorry, but that's an auto decline as well. Story 77. Did a group interview with 4 employees and 1 interviewee. The person called on one of the employees that hadn't asked her a question yet and said, "Are you going to ask me anything?" She was trying to dominate the interview and call out one of the interviewers for not asking a question yet. Then the candidate went on to tell us that she is allergic to all fruit, but she loves fruit and eats it every day, so she takes Benadryl daily to balance it out. What? Just don't eat fruit? How is this something you want to mention in an interview? Story 78. We had a girl come in who basically already had the job. She worked at a different franchise, but wanted to transfer to our store, which was closer to home. When she made a mistake, and I started to gently correct her, she cut me off mid-sentence with, "I know." "Idiot, you don't know you just did it wrong." Then she goes super friendly and went way overboard on some jokes. Said she could beat our boss in a fight. Even walked up to her and did the arm thing to measure herself against our boss, who is petite, and was still interviewing her, and was not impressed. She didn't get hired. Story 79. Most common thing I've seen is people complaining about previous jobs, supervisors, which just makes me think they have a bad attitude. If I ask you about a challenge you faced in a previous job, it may be appropriate to mention a negative, ideally focusing on how you worked through it or fixed it. But talking crap about a previous supervisor or coworker, especially unsolicited, is definitely a hard pass for me. Story 80. One day I was working our front desk because the secretary was on her lunch break. My next interview walks into the waiting area while I'm there and proceeds to make an absolute ass out of himself, not realizing I'm the one who will be interviewing him. His face just dropped when I stood to introduce myself. He knew he would not be getting the job. Just a tip, always carry yourself professionally when seeking employment, even when you are not directly in the interview. You never know who will be observing your behavior, and being abusive to staff you perceive to be unimportant is not a good look. Story 81. I was interviewing for a tech position 2 years ago, and one of the guys that looked good on paper came in. It was a mess. He didn't know half of what was on his resume and couldn't accurately explain the most basic of tech questions. When it came time to wrap up the interview and I asked if he had any questions for us, his first question was, "What's your attendance policy? Would I be in trouble for missing work? Have a nice day. Goodbye." Story 82. Interviewee began the interview with, "I am one of the smartest people in the world. I am so smart, in fact, that I have created my own language, which I use exclusively for the rest of this interview." To this day, I have no idea if his tech skills were any good, but he did provide us with entertainment for an afternoon as we invited everyone in the office to ask him any questions they liked. Story 83. Candidate was wearing sunglasses and flip-flops. The job was in media. We're pretty casual, but it's an interview. I want to see your eyes, not your toes. Asked if he'd be okay to remove the sunglasses. He did. He looked pretty stoned. Didn't get the job. Story 84. My boss told me this. He was a district manager for a large cell phone franchise. He was interviewing a woman for a full-time position in one of the stores. He asked what her long-term goal with the company was, and she replied, "I want your job," thinking she just meant she wants to be a distinct manager. He took it as a good thing. Then she clarified that she didn't want to just be a district manager. She wanted his actual job and for him to be out of a job altogether. She didn't get hired. Story 85. As part of an interview for a sales job, the recruiters took people outside to do surveys. What's your favorite food? Where would you travel if money wasn't an issue, etc. I was smoking a cigarette around the corner watching them when one came up to me and said, "Hey, I'm doing this stupid survey for a job I don't even want. Will you help me out?" I pulled my coat aside to reveal my sweater with the name of the company printed on the breast. She said, "Oh, damn," and ran away. I think she was stoned too. Needless to say, she didn't get the job. Story 86. I worked on Wall Street, and when I was leaving my job as admit, I got the best resume. Wish I saved it. A guy who said he just wanted to work with honest people who didn't do substances and says he had been tortured by the army. Story 87. 3 minutes into the interview, the candidate looks at his watch and tells me to hurry up because his meter is running. Turns out he didn't properly research the location of the job and parked extremely far away. The interview itself lasted less than 5 minutes. Story 88. As an interviewer, I like to give general feedback to candidates in the end about the CV, their performance, how they could improve, etc. This is regardless of their chances of getting the job, but I want them to take something useful back home even if it does not work out. Biggest red flag when someone cannot handle that. Story 89. Having a typo can be the kiss of death. I put friend A, job seeking, in contact with friend B, hiring. Friend A has a keen technical mind, but is a lousy speller. Friend B forwarded me friend A's. "Hi, I'm interested in your job" email, and it was normal for friend A. Absolutely rife with spelling errors and poor grammar. As friend B put it, "We do 90% of our customer interaction via email. I can't hire this person. He didn't even put a space between isn't and getting." Story 90. Salaries are pretty fixed for our openings, and I've always been straightforward with what we can and cannot offer. One time, an applicant with zero experience in our industry had a full-blown argument with me because he didn't like our offer. He proceeded to say that I should just pass him for the initial assessment, and he'll negotiate with the final interviewer. Told him I'm also calibrated to conduct final assessments and that I refuse to continue with his application. Needless to say, he threw another fit before storming off. Story 91. One time we were holding open interviews. These bring out the strangest people. This dude's pipe fell out of his pocket during his interview. He bent over to pick it up and casually stuck it back in his pocket. The woman interviewing him was like, I can't hire you, right? And he was just like, "Yep." Story 92. Had someone apply for a service desk job at my last place of employment. He had a really nice resume. Came into the interview, and when asked about his troubleshooting methodology and how he would go about solving an issue if he had never seen it before, his reply was, "Well, I would search the dark web for answers. I know how to do it, and I've done it before." It was very difficult to not start laughing. Story 93. I recently interviewed a chef. I hadn't even gotten to the point of telling him what our menu theme was, and he took off his mask and said he won't wear one if I told him to. Then he starts telling me how my restaurant was going to run, and a bunch of menu items that aren't even close to our theme. I told him he should go start his own restaurant, call it the Pandemic Cafe. Story 94. Not a funny answer, but how they talk about their former employer and if they mention drama in their interview. I had awful experiences hiring anyone who said they left their last job because management sucked or there was always drama. Usually red flags for, I don't respect my boss and I am always in drama. Story 95. The middle-aged guy who explained that his conviction was all a misunderstanding. That girl at the grocery store just didn't want him hugging her, and he thought she did, and then nodded off during the interview. Story 96. Not har, but I used to wait tables. And occasionally someone looking for a job would ask for an application and sit down at a table to fill it out and order a meal while they filled out the application. I probably waited on 8 people who did this while I worked there, and none of them left a tip. Needless to say, those 8 people didn't even get called in for an interview. Story 97. Bluffing. If you don't know the answer to a question, just say so and maybe describe how you'd go about finding out the answer. If you pretend to know what you don't, you can duck right off. Story 98. Being late, having your mother call to ask about your application status, telling me you have to apply for jobs so you can continue to get unemployment benefits. Story 99. Candidates started off by telling me they tried to get hired at the big tech companies and were rejected. We were their fallback, and they intended to leave as soon as they could to go to a big tech company. I appreciated the honesty because that was the easiest no-hire decision. Story 100. I have a question that involves a candidate reading through some functional hot garbage code. The objective is to explain what the code accomplishes, and then another question about what advice you'd give the programmer of the hot garbage. The answer is never, "It looks fine, no input." Recruiters and HR, what red flags do you find in a resume which means the interviewee is not what they seem? Story 1. I once read one of someone who claimed to have a psychology degree from the university I had attended. Since it was several states away, this stuck out, since he didn't know how to spell psychology. I obviously knew he was lying, but it was open panel interviews, so I spoke with him face to face anyway. The look of shock and terror in his eyes when I said I was thrilled to see that we were alums from the same place and started discussing details of campus was kind of fun to witness. Story 2. Dude put on his resume CCNA -1 under certifications. The CCNA is a Cisco network certification. During the interview, I asked what the -1 meant. He said, "Oh, I missed the certification by only one question." I asked how we could verify that. He sort of shrugged. Story 3. 5 years worth of graphic design experience, but no portfolio because of a crashed hard drive. This was before cloud backups were much a thing. Rest of the story. I rolled the dice, gave them a chance because all of the other applicants were terrible, and they were one of my best hires. Story 4. The recruiting team at my company tossed away a CV from a guy because he had Domino's pizza delivery driver on it as his current role. When I'm hiring for my team, I make it a point to look at binned CVs just to check I'm not missing a diamond in the rough. When I looked at this guy's credentials, it turned out that he was driving for Domino's while completing his master's degree and had technical qualifications up to his eyeballs. I hired him after bringing him in for interviews, and he's now my right-hand man. Another guy I interviewed had a perfect CV but refused to shake my hand or make eye contact throughout the interview. That was a big nope. Another started ranting about his current company and how crap they are. Another nope. Hiring people is exhausting. Story 5. I was following up with references one time on 3 different employees. We are seasonal, so we do a big hire all at once. Employee 1, the first person I called was extremely confrontational and asked why I was calling her of all people. I explained she was listed as a reference and dead silence. Then, I went to high school with her 30 years ago. Barely knew her then and haven't talked to her since. Employee 2, reference said to me, she listed me as her boss. I met her once in passing. We worked in the same building but different departments with completely different management. I've never worked with this person, nor could I tell you her job title. Employee 3, what did my daughter do this time? When I asked if I was speaking with, insert name. So she listed her mom as a reference. I asked if her daughter had ever worked for her, as it was listed she was her last boss, and she laughed and said no. All 3 of those were automatic no's. Story 6. Not in HR, but when I ran a small office years ago, I received a resume from a young woman who bragged she was a member of Mensa, had been a research associate at a prestigious university, etc. She also mentioned 3 times she was not a Republican. I thought, well, cool, but I don't think that really has anything to do with the job. It took me about a day to figure out she was trying to say she was a notary public, which threw the whole Mensa thing into doubt. Story 7. There was a period where people would attach a photo of themselves on or with their resume. I had a young girl about 19 years old attach a photo to her resume. The issue was that the photo was of her in a bikini on her knees at the water's edge with her hands behind her head, sticking her chest out. She was smoking hot but did not quite make the shortlist. She may have gotten the job if we had an eye for tail and not detail. She should have checked what she was sending. Story 8. Not an official manager, but I did take part in the hiring process at the store where I used to work as a senior associate, so I reviewed a lot of resumes. The biggest one was when the person was way overqualified. I was at a failing, no-name gun store run by a guy who thought that he was going to be the next gun superstore, next manufacturer of America's service weapons, and next major private military company. That's a story for another day. My manager, who was the only person who kept the company running, showed me a resume from a guy who claimed he was an armorer and gunsmith for Thirst Special Forces Group and Delta Force. Had been a primary consultant for just about every major small arms and missile system used in the United States military, had been consultant to dozens of police departments on service weapons and tactics, among other things that should have made him want to only apply to us government positions and large firearms manufacturers. So what was he doing applying to some no-name gun store? My boss meter went up, and so did that of my manager. Our stupid boss, of course, ignored our warnings and hired the guy. Turns out, he completely lied. I spent most of my time fixing all the things he wrecked, apologizing to customers for him not doing his work, and having to sit through him making blatantly false claims about technical facts regarding firearms. Story 9. Skills. Tactical use of a Segway. Experience in defending large malls from terrorists. Clearly, he is downplaying his skills. Somebody of that caliber is overqualified. Story 10. Just last month, I was hiring a receptionist team lead for a clinic, and one of our candidates spent a good quarter of a page telling us about his boxing career, including statistics that meant absolutely nothing to me. Story 11. A finalist applicant for a senior software developer position checked the box for yes next to, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Our workplace does not automatically count out felons. So I looked him up, only to find out his charges were from 10 years prior and had been lowered to a misdemeanor. This guy had been checking yes on those boxes for 10 years and had never actually been convicted of a felony. Story 12. You forgot the serious tag, mate. In a resume, red flags I've seen may be overly charged resume with meaningless information. Focus on what you know is relevant for the job. If it's not directly relevant but you want it mentioned, keep it short and to the point. I don't care about your GCSE grades or the entire curriculum of your courses. Just tell me what you learned that is going to help you do the job correctly. I need to see why you fit the position advertised, not that you've done 1,000 irrelevant feats. A resume with a very high number of typos and spelling mistakes. A couple of errors here and there, I can understand. But if you clearly didn't make an effort to triple-check your resume, or if you have issues or trouble in this area, didn't take the time to ask someone to help you with it, it tells a lot about the kind of work I can expect from you. Story 13. I had a resume once where a guy had obviously just copy and pasted job descriptions as his work history. It was blatantly obvious because everything was in third person. Guy didn't even take the time to edit it. Candidate will be able to type wording. I gave him an interview and asked him tough questions based off of his supposed work experience. I was morbidly curious if he was just bad at writing resumes or just a lazy liar. Turns out he was the latter. When I interview someone, I usually try and ease up on questions when it's obvious the candidate doesn't have the required experience. I don't want someone leaving totally demoralized, etc. I didn't let up on this guy, though, and when he couldn't answer a question, I would comment that he had it listed in his resume. Hopefully, he learned a lesson. Story 14. Too many jobs in too short period of time was always a red flag. But lately, with all that's gone on, I've had 3 different jobs in a year when my original career was decimated by the pandemic. So I have a changed perspective now. Red flag doesn't mean they're out or have no chance. It means I will dig deeper. Could be circumstances or it could be you. Depends on your qualifications and skills, not experience, that dictate my actions. Story 15. I was helping recruiting a new devie, but there was this one guy who was selected for the interview that I did not see. Was checked by other team members. All right, so far so good. It was strange that he went straight to the interview without doing a task first. But they said he was very experienced, so all right. He went to the interview, and in the end, the boss, who didn't know anything about code, was incredibly amazed. I think I never saw him that amazed at any other professional. Fast forward, dude was just a heavy weight on us. We were doing all the work. He was impossible to hit discussions with because anything different than his opinion or crossing the borders of his knowledge, he was snap. He was way older than us and treated us like dumb children. He was far too old school and refused to upgrade his game. He was also earning far more than everyone in the whole company, and he never did a task to get in. He just used his BS talk and sold him immediately as a genius. But 5 minutes into talking to him introducing ourselves, and I noticed that he was a git who would make it hard on everyone. Story 16. I have conducted well over 100 interviews for engineering positions during my career so far. I could immediately tell that someone was pulling a fast one on their resume if they list a prestigious title with virtually no description of the activities performed, or if they only had 12 months of duration at 10 different companies. Those two things screamed, especially combined, screamed disaster pinball. It meant they get a high-paying job, linger around for a bit, collect the paychecks, and when they finally get pushed to do some work, it's a disaster. They either quit or get fired and then find a new victim. Another interesting one is when you call someone's listed references and they go, "Who? Oh yeah, I worked with him for like 2 months. Reference? He listed me as a reference? Ha! Oh, yeah, I worked with him. Can you tell anything about his work ethic or accomplishments?" Long pause? No. Click. Yes, that happens several times. I shouldn't admit this, but a few of us did something similar to that when we were trying to get the scoop on a manager who had been hired in and was a walking disaster. A few of us called colleagues at his previously listed companies to ask about him. Strangely, nobody would talk about him, or they would say, "I'm not allowed to talk about it, legally." Red flag much? How the flying hell did he get hired in the first place? Another one is the somewhat common lying about your education resume. Personally, I never really questioned most for education. If they say they have whatever, okay, I'll figure out really quick if that's true or not in the interview. In my entire time doing hiring and interviews, I only ever encountered a handful of people who flat out lied about their education, and I'm not talking truth stretching. To be honest, I'm a truth stretcher. I finished 3 degrees in engineering, but only got a diploma for one of them. Life happened. I list the other 2 as studied completed, which is factual. What I mean as a flat-out lie is when someone lists the year they graduated, which directly conflicts with something else on their resume, such as where they worked. So you worked and lived 150 miles away from your college, which doesn't offer remote classes for that type of degree. Single case where someone slipped through the cracks after I interviewed them, and their entire education history was fraudulent. Poor guy was an awesome worker, but he did get fired over the incident. Story 17. Trust me, no one cares about your hobbies or interest. Just show me exactly what you can give value to the job you're applying to. The minimum you can do is check your resume grammar, spelling, technical details, and if you are really qualified for the job. Dear candidate, trust me, we are all searching for better opportunities, and for sure, we are all looking to get paid the highest salary in the world. But don't show any cheap CV in order for the recruiter to consider you as a professional, not a child. Just a kind reminder, your CV won't stay at the HR level. It might go to different personnel from HR department, chief technical officer, chief operating officer, chief financial officer, head of security, and sometimes the shareholders. I would definitely expect to see your current job title or expected job title. Be realistic. Clean and a very short brief about you, 3 to 4 lines max, no spelling or grammar mistakes. If you don't have any experience because you are a fresh graduate, then tell me what you did during this phase while applying in order to earn the following job position: certificate, training, seminar, books, publications, projects, whatever. If you have any experience present, the months of experience, in case you can provide any proof, it would be amazing and more solid. If not, make it very technical, no more than 5 to 8 responsibilities at max. Because no one is willing to read 10 pages of your achievements, you are not a Superman. Keep it well designed and well formatted. It will be easier to read, comprehend, and search for the keywords to hire you. If you can't do the format by yourself, just spend at least a few dollars on those resume builders, either to take any idea on how to create a really presented one or generate a new one. Hopefully, all those points were really helpful for you as a reader to enhance your CV and catch the amazing job opportunity. Story 18. Not doing any hiring, recruiting now, but when I did, a big red flag was when someone had a string of brief jobs, especially if they were all in the same field. If someone was young and worked 6 months at Big Hamburger and 6 months at Amusement Park X before entering the field, no big deal. If someone over 25 had a resume with every other mental health provider in the area and didn't make it any of those agencies, it was an indicator that they wouldn't be a good fit for us either. Story 19. Had a buddy put that he could speak Japanese fluently on his resume and applied to a Japanese manufacturing company in the US. During the interview, the hiring manager asked him about it, and he promptly responded, "Hi, Nihongo ga wakarim akrapa." So they went and got one of the Japanese cheese and was like, "Okay, Mr. Honda, have a conversation with this guy." Needless to say, all my buddy could say was hi, and it was very awkward for everyone involved. He is a git ha. Story 20. In general, if I see decent formatting, the minimum requirements for the job, and no major grammar spelling errors, I'm going to at least call the person as a courtesy for taking the time to fill out the application. If a company has a recruiter to fill internals positions, they are 9 times out of 10 wanting to hire anyone who checks the boxes their management has set in place. Can you work the minimal hours for the job? Do you have the right licenses for the job? Can you pass a substances test? I caution anyone to think about whether they actually want the job before taking it, though. I've worked in a customer service, sales call center, and it is brutal mentally for $16 an hour. We all have to get or start somewhere, though. If you have no bachelor's degree but want to work a job that pays decent wages, my advice is learn a trade, welding, plumbing, etc. Get a semi-truck license. Some employers will pay for you to get one in exchange for a driving contract, or get a LPN license, 2 years. All 3 of those jobs are always in demand. Truck driving is good if you like Red Bull and podcasts. A trade is good if you want to be your own boss once you get your journeyman. And an LPN is great if you want to help people and make $18 or $35 an hour. Another perk is you can basically work what hours you want if you sign on with a home care agency and are clear about your availability. Story 21. The resume is what gets you the interview. So if you're physically there, it means your resume is good. Now, if you don't know why you're there, that is, you can't answer basic questions about the job you've applied for, or you just seem like a different person, it means that A, someone else wrote your application, and B, you haven't prepared either or both, or I've done a bad job and haven't caught on that you were obviously lying in your application. Story 22. Someone claimed to be a member of the New York State Bar, admission pending, which I thought meant that he had already passed the New York Bar, but just needed to submit the doc requirements and take the oath. During the interview, I asked when he could start, and he said right after he takes the New York Bar exam later that week, then he could start right after. Okay, and I'm a doctor of philosophy too. Just wait and let me submit my application. Story 23. For me, it's when someone who's young with lots of wordy descriptions for basic jobs. Senior executive in charge of caffeine distribution isn't a title. You got coffee? Embrace that. It's fine. If you were the best coffee runner, fine. Glorifying basic crap in a resume makes you come across as a liar. Story 24. TAR coordinator here. Overly extensive hobby sections and keeping honor societies. Achievements from high school scream that they didn't look outside school to get real-life experience. Story 25. Before word processing software and online applications, my two biggest red flags was not being able to spell the name of the school they claimed to have graduated from and the name of the street they lived on. Story 26. Describing job duties, experiences differently than the resume. Resume says you were a manager of a store, but you recite a story about being a cashier. Not being able to give any real-life examples and just use hypotheticals. Tell us about a time you dealt with an angry customer, and the answering being something vague and generic. Gaps between jobs can be a red flag in general, but sometimes that can be missed during a screening process. Story 27. When the applicant lists someone who is obviously a family member, or they're applying for an entry-level position, but they list a really expensive and recognized technical certificate on their resume like CISP or CC. Story 28. I don't think many candidates realize that most companies have some sort of an applicant tracking system, so the new application with a completely different resume will land in the same candidate profile as the older ones. I've seen more candidates that I can count that have a completely different resume depending on the position. Also a LinkedIn profile with different experience than the resume. My personal favorite was the resume that plagiarized the job description that I personally wrote as the responsibility section of their last job on their resume. When I'm not sure if it's legit, I'll take a sentence, copy and paste it into Google, and oftentimes a completely different person's LinkedIn profile will come up in the search results. Story 29. Not the hiring manager or HR, but happened to be in my boss's office while she was going through resumes. While we were talking, I noticed a name on the top of the stack that looked familiar and quickly glanced to see if I could confirm who I thought it was. Once we were done talking, I said, I don't mean to intrude, but if that resume belongs to the person I think it does, she's a felon. It was someone I'd gone to college with that was very proud of her bad status and substances use. Often told me about how her boyfriend was back in jail for dealing, and how she didn't have physical custody of her daughter. Not that felons can't be solid workers, but in our industry, it's kind of important not to be. She thought it was so funny and let me look it over to confirm. She said, well, that explains the 4-year gap here. Even called her to send her one of those pre-interview questionnaires, and this girl called back to ask the answers because she couldn't find them. These answers are freely available on our website, and most are common sense. Story 30. Literally had a guy who was not who his resume said he was. He emailed his resume. We spoke on the phone and set up an interview. Day of, he shows up and hands me an updated resume. It had a completely different name on it than the first one. For a minute, I thought I had gotten my candidates mixed up, but when I asked him about it, he told me he'd had his name legally changed. While we were waiting for the elevator, I said, I've never met anyone who changed their name before. Can I ask why? Oh, it was just time for a change, he said offhandedly. During the interview, he threw up like 10 other red flags so we didn't hire him. Got the vibe that he was making a bunch of stories up. Contradicted himself a few times. Tripped up on easy questions. I've always been curious about the reason for his name change since he seemed so shady in general. In fact, remembering now that one of his previous employers, according to his resume, was, let's say, Danton Inc., his new last name, Danton, shady AF. Story 31. I left my previous job due to a bad manager who would bully and belittle us. She made our work lives hell and tried to do the same with our personal lives too. Then 3 years later, she was fired. In that time, I had been promoted at my new job and I was hiring my replacement. She knew I would be interviewing as my details were on the job advertisement, but she applied for the role, with a copy of my CV with her name attached. She must have kept my CV from when I worked for her, which is a breach in data protection. But how on earth she thought I wouldn't notice or remember her truly goes to show how delusional she was. Story 32. A huge red flag, but too late. The guy that showed up for the job was clearly not the same guy as was in the phone interview. Impossible to prove. And messy, since he had been given the job. He's still with us. Story 33. Make sure you send the right CV. I've seen an application to a senior position where the guy wrote something like, I would be the perfect fit for the position at insert company name here because... The only problem was, the company name was not our. In fact, it was our biggest competitor. Well, not really. We knew he applied there as well, but we didn't expect him to make such a crucial mistake. He didn't get the job. We didn't even invite him. Considering the fact that everything else from his CV matched 100% with the CV he sent into that other company, again, we talked to each other, doesn't make him seem really intelligent. The only thing he had to get right was changing the company name. Story 34. Kind of related, we insisted on consultants doing a presentation, sometimes on a software item, but mainly on our company history. Honestly, it wasn't about the content, but how they presented, dealt with questions, etc. We had one guy come in, insist that no one see his presentation ahead of time and that he'd bring his own laptop. We got suspicious and invited lots of people along to be presented with a dramatized version of our company history made from badly formed Lego people, in which he had a script with awful punchlines. The final punchline got mixed up, so his dramatic ending was ruined by shuffling of papers and a lot of, I got that wrong. He'd spent weeks on this, but zero time on how he was a good consultant or remembering his CV. Poor lad was terrible, and we just couldn't take a punt on him. Story 35. Not my story, but my older brother's. He's a sales executive for a startup data management company and heard from either his boss or coworker, can't exactly remember, about someone they were definitely going to hire with a very impressive resume. Top tennis player of a very expensive and renowned high school, went to a good college, had supposedly traveled and done some important work throughout Europe, etc. My brother talked to him and mentioned they were pretty close to each other location-wise, since brother had recently moved back to our hometown due to quarantine, and the other dude had apparently moved into a decently close city, and that their high schools were also near each other. He ended up doing some more research on the soon-to-be recruit and found an article on a tennis match from when he was in high school, which was dated right around the time he was supposed to have already graduated college and been working in Europe. Suffice to say, he didn't land the job. Story 36. I find that in the age of Indeed and other job applicant advertisement websites, the ease of fielding more job opportunities by posting one's resume and having related jobs recommended by the algorithm is tempered by the employer feeling empowered to require minimum 5 years experience for an entry-level position. While this is not exactly what we are talking about here, in my opinion, it creates a dynamic of bees. The employer is obviously taking advantage of a crap job market, and for the applicant to respond with courtesy and acceptance of blatant unfairness should actually be the red flag. Story 37. When they don't even show up for the interview. I know that's not exactly what OP is asking, but when I was hiring, the R department would qualify candidates and set up interviews. I'd confirm the day before, and still about 50% of people would just not show up, or they'd come up with some stupid excuse. So I'd give them a second chance and ask to reschedule, and then they'd never get back to me. My coworkers told me it was because they were most likely on unemployment and had to apply to jobs to keep their benefits, but didn't want to actually work. Story 38. So I've worked in military recruitment for 7 years and was dealing with reservist applicants. So, the youngest some can join is 16 with parental consent. So, when an underage applicant comes for an appointment, a parent accompanies them. And when we see the teenage not enthusiastic about joining the military, but the parents are absolutely in favor of their kid joining the reserves, we get some concerns. This is usually seen as the kid is not talking or asking questions, but the parent will go on for hours and ask questions for days if they could. In my recruiting department, we refer those applicants as parental conscripts. They are joining the volunteer force under the pressure of their family. And yes, it never works out. The applicant gets on, and then after a month, the training unit will start complaining about the lack of interest by the new recruit, and in less than a year, the parental conscript is gone. Story 39. Street talk spelling. Most common and number one Pima is when people use me when my would be correct. Me resume is included. But then in Dutch, where it would be me when Mischen is the appropriate one. It's a clear sign of their writing skills being very bad. Fonts all over the place and use of word art. It shows they lack any creativity whatsoever. Bonus -10 for Comic Sans. Using a large font to spread a one-page resume over 3 pages. Often not the most honest person. I say often, some just refuse reading glasses. A lot of unexplained gaps in work history or a lot of short periods. Resume made in Notepad or one copy pasted from a temp agency. Some green flags I personally have seen. Ones that positively stood out, handwritten letter. Maybe I'm an old soul, but I'm a sucker for handwritten letters. Letter and resume adapted to company they applied at. Humor used correctly. Story 40. I have many funny employee stories as a retail manager. The one that sticks out is that I had a former regional manager apply for a sales associate. Way below his position, it was a big red flag, but we were opening a new store and needed anyone we could get. He came in for the interview, and when I mentioned that we do background checks, he got nervous and then said, "I have something I'm not proud of that you will find. All I want to say is that I was not in my right mind and I am better now." I Googled him. He was in the news for calling a bomb threat at his last job about a month earlier. Honestly, I felt bad for him. He seems to have had it rough at that time, but there was no way the higher-ups were going to hire him. Story 41. Fluff job descriptions. Like, I know what an employee at McDonald's does. I don't need all 36 of your responsibilities in a job title like meat equipment expert or customer satisfaction engineer. Horrible references. I had a guy's old boss straight tell me he was one of the laziest, worst employees he'd ever had, and that he'd fired him for a combination of poor ethic, attendance, and the belief he was working high, claiming experience that they don't have. I hired a lot of skilled labor, and I'd get people claiming to be millwrights or PLC programmers who couldn't tell you the first thing about what that work entailed. But even lower pay grade positions did that. Plenty of people would claim years of welding experience, but couldn't tell you the bare basics, like what kind of welding they'd done. My favorite was a custom fabricator who, when asked what he fabricated, answered, fabrics. Story 42. Years ago, recruiters would be given a certain number of adverts that had to be used. Got so fed up of developers saying they had experience in a language, then when shortlisted and tested, they didn't have a clue. One lad would always lose his crap about this and decided to invent a language called Bixby Pro and included it in his advert, saying that applicants needed at least 12-month experience of Bixby Pro. We got CVSs with Bixby Pro experience noted in skill sets. Story 43. I worked as sort of the HR person for a few years. We did sheet metal manufacturing, and we'd often advertise for general labor jobs. We often got applications filled out by people for whom English was a difficult second language. I laughed out loud at one application because where we asked something along the lines of, "What skills, qualities do you have that would make you an asset to our team?" the applicant wrote 2 words, posture and beauty. That made me laugh for a few days until I realized there was a mattress manufacturer in town called Posture Beauty, which also went through waves of hiring general laborers. Here I thought this guy was telling us he was eye candy. Still makes me laugh. Story 44. I once saw a retail CV where the person said they had great attention to detail and then immediately followed that by saying they had extensive experience working with customers. Story 45. A few gems from interviewing software engineers. They said they had literally thousands of projects and never missed a deadline. In speaking to them, we found out that they counted every Git commit. One claimed to have never been wrong, because if you learn from it, you aren't wrong. My CTO had him solve a simple problem for explaining how to implement a remainder operator. They failed horribly. The next day, they emailed the answer and thought they weren't wrong. My favorite, a person claimed to have dreamed up the Tiptronic transmission. They said the only reason they didn't make money is because they didn't know how to file a patent. We have since moved on from the recruiter that brought these people in. Story 46. So there is a myth that ATS's or applicant tracking system auto-reject candidates based on their resumes. In reality, their ATS is basically a project management tool that recruiters use to track the hiring process. We see each and every application that comes in. So my red flag is when applicants jam their resume with keywords so they can beat the ATs. Double points if they include the keywords at the bottom in white font. It shows me they are just trying to game the system. Another one is if they lie on prelim questions. We sometimes include qualifier questions as part of the application process for certain jobs, if there are elements candidates must have. I've definitely had candidates claim they had the required skills on the application, when in reality they don't. Story 47. I'm not sure what exactly triggered my instincts when I was viewing a CV from one particular candidate. It looked somewhat normal first, but then I got a bad feeling as there seemed to be just too many buzzwords. They claimed to have worked in a security company, and I checked their website. It looked otherwise normal, but some text boxes on the bottom part of the page were lorem ipsum. I did not find any legit information about the company, so I asked CISO to take a look at the profile. He agreed that it looks dodgy indeed. Let's reject. I'm not sure if that was actually the CISO just testing the people doing recruitment or a real attempt to gather information about the fintech company I was working for. Story 48. Submitting a full body photo with your resume for an office job. For an acting job, sure makes sense. For an office job, I've seen people include a headshot on their resume, which personally, I think is weird, but okay. But you do not need to send a full body shot of what looks like yourself dressed up for some sorority event in college. It's creepy and comes off inappropriate. When I'm looking at multiple candidates with similar work experience, Someone who inexplicably submits a full-body photo with their resume is definitely not getting an interview. I wish I could say I've only come across this once. It's bizarre. Story 49. Obligatory, not HR recruiter. But I was a supervisor at a convenience store, so would often have to sort through CVs, British word for resumes, for my manager to look at. The major ones were straight as in everything, but with horrendous use of spelling and grammar. Or people would attach a covering letter saying they want full-time work of 39 hours, but would list their availability. And it would be something like 8 hours a week total. I think one of the best and most hilarious red flags I ever saw was for a bakery position, where the applicant listed 10 years at bakery school and 6 years at culinary college when she was 21 years old. Story 50. I'm not in recruiting, but a guy I know did once send me his resume to see if it could be improved, and I've never seen anything like it. He went into detail about how his dad doesn't work anymore and how he hates his parents and wants to leave home. Then he went on to say that his legs are stronger than they look, but he can't sleep on his side or he gets headaches. I advised him to start again and sent him mine as a reference point. He eventually got a position after changing it. Story 51. Had a candidate apply for a role at a medical clinic. She mentioned that she used to work for the state of Alabama and had a large gap in her work. Did a quick search and turns out she did, in fact, work for Alabama. She was also convicted and served 7 years for playing a key part in a scheme that stole over $1 million from the state while working in that role. This would be her first job after getting out, and it would have involved handling large sums of money and sensitive patient files. Nope. Story 52. I helped manage a small retro gaming kiosk at the mall years and years ago. I got people asking to drop off applications all the time. The very first thing I would look at was their email address. That sorted out about 80% of the candidates. One person had 5-finger discount in their email address. I didn't know if that was referencing theft or the Leftover Substances song, but I wasn't taking chances. Overall, a good rule of thumb to figure out if somebody has common sense is, do they have a real professional email address, or are they using the one they've had since they were 13 years old? Story 53. I interviewed a girl with 12 jobs in 18 months. Longest job was 2 weeks. I spoke to her on the phone, but she could barely tell me her name. The thing is, she actually sent me the contracts she signed with the 12 companies, so how she was able to get 12 real offers, and in the time span of only 18 months, is still beyond me. Another one wrote his language abilities as follow: Cantonese, native Mandarin, fluent English, can speak. Story 54. I keep a fairly low profile in my organization, and when interviewing to promote within, I have had people attempt to subtly claim responsibility for work they didn't know was actually mine. Usually people who do this aren't intending to lie, they just don't really recognize the depth of some of the things we do. Story 55. Anytime someone lists a million stats on their resume, for example, increased productivity by 50%, grew sales by 200%, you better believe I'm asking you about those during the interview and how you accomplished this. I have yet to come across anyone who was able to demonstrate how they weren't just along for the ride as the company they worked for achieved those stats. Story 56. Worked in an imaging clinic and asked applicant why they wanted to work in our clinic. They replied, I call in sick a lot and figured you guys would understand. Did not hire them. Story 57. I saw a lady set off a patient bathroom emergency alarm because there wasn't anyone at the front desk. When several people came to address the alarm, she started asking about a job. That is like calling 911. And when the police arrive, ask them about a job. Story 58. I was interviewing for a customer service position once. I told the guy most customer interaction will be over email, very few phone calls. He then says, good because I don't take no crap. Next, the auto mod made me think about this. If you still have an AOL email address, I automatically think you aren't very tech savvy. Sorry. Story 59. Copy and pasting. Or I had one guy that linked a website portfolio with videos he made. I think they were supposed to be artistic, but were full of creepy images. And videos. Pictures of him playing the bassoon because he was a professional bassoonist. Unfortunately, I was hiring for a math science tutor, and this wasn't very relevant to the job. Story 60. When your current job position in your CV is simply chair. No description, no company name, no date, no nothing. Just damn chair. Damn, I hate being asked to review CVs and to do interviews, no matter how much I prepare either the people I'm interviewing with. My boss, Har, or the interviewee makes it a total crap show 90% of the time.